I'm Scott Slapin of the Slapin-Solomon viola duo, and I'm here today to talk about vibrato on the viola. On any instrument, vibrato is a bit of a controversial subject because some people believe that it wasn't used all that much before the 20th century. There are sources that disprove that. In the Baroque era, Gemignani advocated continuous vibrato. Leopold Mozart complained about continuous vibrato, which meant that it was being used. He just didn't personally like it, because nobody complains about things that aren't around to bother them. So I think what can more accurately be said about vibrato is more vibrato, less vibrato. It comes in phases. People react against a period maybe when they felt there was too much, and then there becomes too little. So it's coming in and out of fashion. But even when, for people who advocate what they call a sparing use of vibrato, they're still using it. So if you're a string player, you need it. Another thing that enters into this is that the vast majority of modern string players use metal strings. And because of that, I would argue that vibrato is a necessary part of the sound, at least most of the time. That is to say, on metal strings, if you're playing above mezzo forte, in a reasonably large hall, the sound is very cold without vibrato. So as an example, it's a very cold sound, but I'm going to play what I just did with vibrato. So vibrato adds a necessary warmth to metal strings when you're playing above a certain volume. So yes, it goes with the phrase that when it's louder, more towards the top of the phrase, you want more vibrato, more intense vibrato, wider vibrato. And when it's quieter, you want less or perhaps none. But it's also really a part of the modern sound, at least. Back in the Baroque era, they were using different strings, and the halls were smaller. There were a lot of different variables, and it is certainly possible to play that way with less vibrato, where vibrato can be an ornament. But again, there were also people during the Baroque era who did use vibrato basically all the time, or at least they advocated that. There are different ideas about how vibrato should work. The standard way in the 20th century, the way I learned, the way most people learned, was that the pitch you are trying to achieve, let's say that this arm is a B natural, that you start below the B natural and you come up and you hit the B natural and then you come back down. And so the highest part of the cycle is what you will perceive to be the pitch. So this is a B natural, and so you come down and then back up to the B. And the idea was that whatever the highest part of the cycle is, that will be what you hear as the pitch. It has been since studied. Great artists have been, their recordings have been put in a studio, and they slow it down and they analyze, is that really true? Well, sometimes it does go above the pitch. The reality is there are many different kinds of vibrato. So I don't think that disproves that the first kind exists, but I think what it's saying is in reality, vibrato, you can recognize a lot of artists by their vibrato. You can recognize Heifetz and David Nadian and Emmanuel Vardy, all sorts of people I can think of off of the top of my head, whose vibrato is pretty unique. And if you hear just a couple measures, I know who that is. So there are many different kinds of vibrato. Still, I think, even though it's not universally true, I think it's a good way to think of it, the old way of teaching it, that the highest part of the vibrato is the pitch. Why does that work, even if that's not what you're actually doing? That brings me to a second point, and why vibrato is very difficult to teach. Because with other techniques, it's very straightforward. You explain what to do. With vibrato, all of the exercises that are out there, and I'm not going to go into them here because they've been widely covered in YouTube videos, but all these exercises where you have rhythmical, and you speed it up to triplets and faster, they always bring you to a point that's close to something that's like vibrato. It gets you close. But that final leap of getting to actual vibrato is the tough part, because ultimately that's just emotion. And you sort of have to experiment. Once you go through these different exercises, you have to experiment until you almost stumble on the right motion. And of course, the more you look at videos with good vibrato, you get a sense of what good vibrato looks like. You know what it sounds like. That all of that will help steer you to the right place. But in the same way that there's no exercise that actually brings you exactly to vibrato, in that same way, the way you hear it, also you're not. The vibrato is going so quickly. You're not really aware. Am I hearing the pitch as the highest point of the cycle, or maybe it is in the middle? But you're using your ear to tell you if it sounds in tune, and that's the main point. So I still advocate thinking of the vibrato in the way it used to be taught, even if that's not scientifically right in all the cases, or even in most cases. I still think it's a good idea that can help you get close. But ultimately, vibrato is a motion that once you stumble on it and do it enough times, you know what it feels like. And ultimately, you use your ear to decide whether it sounds in tune. And that's another point is some people believe vibrato hides bad intonation. I don't think that's true. I think the one thing it can do is if you slide into a note. Let's say, right, I played that B a little flat. Well, that there is vibrato, it sort of hides the slide a little bit or makes it sound more acceptable. If I did that with no vibrato, you would. It's a little more obvious that I'm sliding into it. But past that, you can hear if something is in tune or out of tune with vibrato. So I think practicing scales with vibrato, assuming you're the kind of person who doesn't compare vibrato to ketchup and tries to use it as an occasional ornament, assuming you're trying to use a continuous vibrato, I would practice scales and etudes and everything with vibrato, because if you're going to play with vibrato, you want to be able to play in tune with vibrato. But I don't accept that it really hides bad intonation. There are different kinds of vibrato. Again, this is widely covered in the internet. So what people talk about, wrist vibrato and arm vibrato, and then a term that refers, there's finger vibrato, which has two meanings depending on who's talking about it. I think what most of this comes down to is a set of hinges, right? You've got the wrist, you've got the ends of the fingers, you've got all of these joints that can move or that cannot move. So for example, most people start with wrist vibrato. You'll see that my hand up is moving. If I stiffen the wrist so that hinge is no longer, that it's as if it were not there, you'll see that the whole arm is now moving. So that becomes a bit of an arm vibrato, and it sounds different. I'm not a huge fan of arm vibrato, but it has its place. It gets narrower, and so then at the very you can see that this joint, see that final joint, that can move. It's not necessary for that to move to have a good enough vibrato, but I think it sounds, on a viola, I think that's a help, that if you can get that final joint to move. I think on a viola, there is a range of wider and slower vibrato that sounds good. Not that the fast stuff doesn't also sound good, but the wider, slower vibrato gives you a bigger spectrum to choose from. And I did an experiment once. I had a small viola. I strung it up as a violin. and I tuned down the E string so that only the lower the 3 strings that are common to both instruments were up, and I used a fairly wide slow vibrato, you know. And I then tuned the E string up. So same instrument, same size, and that wide slow vibrato sounded terrible. People often say you need a wider, slower vibrato on a viola because the instrument is bigger and the pitches are lower. Well, in this particular case, I corrected for both of those variables because it's the same size instrument, same pitches in this case. I think the difference is actually when the E string is tuned up so that it's tight and not as if it were not on the instrument. The overtone series is different, and it doesn't sound good with that wider, slower vibrato. So I think that's the main difference for violinists picking up a viola. There's a bigger range of vibrato that you have at your disposal, and things that would not sound good on a violin on the very same pitches can sound very nice on a viola. So for that wider, slower range, I think having that final joint able to move will help you out with that, and help you have a vibrato that's more like a singer, who would, a tenor or an alto who would be singing in the range of the viola. So I hope this video is somewhat useful for vibrato on the viola. I hope it had some good ideas to think about, and we hope to be making more videos about viola technique in the future, so I hope you'll come back and check us out.